Welcome back. The theme of the final session is resilience and recovery in the Caribbean. Just as a reminder, my name's Vivienne Francis. I'm the director of One World Media. I'm also a reader and a senior lecturer at the University of the Arts London. So hello to my students. In a much previous life, I was a journalist and producer at the BBC. Before I kick off, I just wanted to give the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. So, Aurora, do you want to start?
Me? Oh, yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. So my name is Aurora Herrera. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, and I have been a journalist since I was about 14 years old. And I didn't start in environmental reporting, as we may go into talk about in the Caribbean. You wear many hats as a journalist because we are severely under-resourced in terms of newsrooms. So it's one of the things that I've done. Most recently, I've done my PhD at City University in journalism culture, and now I lecture at London Met University, and a couple of my students are here as well. So I want to say a special hello to them.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vashan Brown. I was a reporter at Television Jamaica for 12 years. I was also a news anchor during that period as well. I'm currently studying at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm doing a PhD also in journalism culture, but in Jamaica. And as Aurora said, in the Caribbean, we wear many hats. I've covered a number of hurricanes over the period. My students are not here, but I also do teach at the LSE. But sadly, I don't teach in media. I teach in the Department of Sociology. And so, yeah, that's pretty much a little bit about me.
Thank you. When we were putting, of course. When we were putting together the programme, Latin America and the Caribbean, I was really keen that we really championed the Caribbean, because I feel, and some of the reasons we'll discuss, it sometimes gets left off the agenda. So here we have Trinidad, Jamaica and Antigua. So just to exactly, just to set the scene a little bit, when the Caribbean was hit with the Hurricane Beryl last July, it caused billions of pounds worth of damage, and the livelihoods of hundreds of fishermen, farmers was destroyed. In some of the islands towards the southeast of the Caribbean, they calculated that something like 95% of buildings had just been wiped out. It was quite unusual. They said it was the biggest hurricane that had hit the Caribbean that early on in the season ever. And, you know, we're coming towards the end of the 2024 hurricane season, and it's been a very active one. Although, luckily, there's been nothing as big as Beryl, there have been lots of smaller, but quite equally devastating tropical storms and hurricanes. And scientists, of course, predict that as our climate warms, the frequency and intensity of hurricanes will worsen, will increase. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with hurricanes in the Caribbean, and I think the Caribbean is something that, you know, you conjure up images of a sandy beach, a lovely blue sea, you know, an idyllic setting. I just thought it would be quite useful for our panelists to really talk about, you know, what is it like for those people who get caught up in hurricanes? Because as some of the panelists earlier today have described, it's really important to remember the people at the heart of these disasters and at the heart of these challenges. So I'm fortunate that, you know, I've been close, but I haven't experienced a hurricane. But can you sort of share your thoughts on what it's like for the people at the heart of these problems?
Okay, go for it.
One of you. Aurora.
Well, I think the main word we would say is just it's devastating on multiple levels. As you've said, well, the most recent hurricane, about 90% of buildings have been completely destroyed. And it's not just during the hurricane, the aftermath is horrific as well. But if you can imagine being in this situation where before the hurricane, you're preparing to leave your house, seek shelter, maybe there is not the infrastructure of shelter to go to. Number one, where do you go? Number two, when the hurricane actually makes landfall, in itself, that's quite a dangerous time when you have storm surges, massive flooding, dangerous windy conditions where people have been killed in Beryl from these conditions. And of course, in the aftermath, there's nowhere to live. There's dangers to food and water security. There are many water pollution, diseases. Children are suffering. Children will suffer as well because they do not have the type of resource that they need. Their school buildings might have been damaged. Women especially and children are disproportionately affected because they may not be shelters or access to even something as simple as sanitary products for women. So your entire life is completely just gone. And you have no, depending on each country, because we have, each country in the Caribbean is so different and has different resources and infrastructure. But if you're from a tiny country of 50,000 people and you don't have the infrastructure, it's absolutely devastating.
Yeah, picking up on what Aurora already described in a sense. So I was in Jamaica when Hurricane Beryl hit in July. I was in Kingston at the time, and there was a lot of talk and conversation about how the island was spared the wrath of Hurricane Beryl. But the problem with that discourse is that half of the island was flattened. We're talking about the southern belt of the island. Parishes like St. Elizabeth, for example, roofs gone, people are outside of their houses without anywhere to shelter. The government, of course, has shelters in place, but I suppose we'll talk a little bit later on about how shelters are also a band-aid in a sense, because they also don't fix the kind of structural issues. For example, who are more likely to be affected by a hurricane, who are more likely to live in flood-prone areas, who are more likely to live in a very precarious situation where whenever it rains heavily, it doesn't even have to be a hurricane. It rains heavily and you're in your house, you're worried. You don't know what is going to happen because we talk about hurricanes making landfall, but we also don't talk a lot about heavy rainfall that just devastate communities. And as the sky starts to get gray, you're in your house, you're worried because you don't know what will happen. And again, we talk about the impact on utilities. Water supply, for example. The other day when Hurricane Beryl hit in Jamaica, parts of the southern part of the island didn't have electricity for over a month. I think in modern society, that's just crazy to me. And so, we have to talk about the impact on, I think, those kinds of important services as well, because a lot of the water systems in Jamaica, for instance, also need electricity to function as well. So you're talking about the lack of water and electricity for over a month in 2024.
Thank you. So one of the things that following on from that, one of the things that sometimes, very often frustrates me, when there is a hurricane, I'm always thinking, what's happening to my family? Are they okay? What's going on? And although there are some really good YouTube channels, there's some really good informal things on social media, one of the frustrations I have is how hurricanes and tropical storms are reported in the global media when it comes to the Caribbean. It feels, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it feels as if the hurricanes only become a real story when they're heading towards America. And so I just wanted to know, what you thought about that, and if you could explore some of the reasons why we don't get the global coverage. I think in our conversation last week, Aurora, I said, is it because the Caribbean are small? And you're like, no, it's not that. So Vashan, do you want to start first? What was some of the...
Yeah, I think I largely agree with your point when you talk about the fact that, the Western media cares about hurricanes in the Caribbean when it's heading to the US or somewhere else. And I think a lot of the conversation has focused a lot on Latin America as well, whether it's Mexico and so on and so forth. But I think as well, part of the challenge is that there is this intense focus on the Caribbean when there is this period between June and November, the hurricane season. And outside of that, there's very little discussion on the Caribbean when it comes to climate change outside of that particular period, because hurricanes are usually what we use to, I suppose, discuss climate change in the Caribbean. And outside of that kind of period between June and November, there's very little discourse in the Western media. Before I came to this, I was looking, for example, at the number of media houses that looked at Hurricane Beryl and the kind of angle that they've taken to those kinds of stories as well. And you're right in the sense that a lot of those discussions focused on, okay, so CNN, for example, did a story, okay, what is going to happen to the US next? So, okay, sure, there's devastation in the Caribbean, in places like Jamaica and so on and so forth. That's so bad. But let's focus on the United States and so there is this kind of focus on, I suppose, that nationalistic angle in a sense as well, I think.
I think there are a couple of things at play, and it looks at global priorities, right? The Caribbean, even though we're 44 million people strong, and over 40 islands, and lots more territories as well, that's not where the big money is. Let's just be honest. That's not where the stories are that we want to cover that make the money. That's not where the financial flows center. Now, let's be clear. Warming past 1.5 degrees Celsius is a matter of life and death for, as we can clearly see, for Caribbean people and for big ocean states or small island developing countries, depending on how you want to phrase it. And it is so severe, yet media houses have said, well, we don't have the budget for that. We're not going to cover this. We need to cover the Middle East. We need to cover what's going on in the election in America, but will not focus or cannot give budget towards places like this. And that results in, a knock-on effect of just a lack of education, a lack of expectation, a lack of, as you said when you started off, sun, sand, and sea sort of expectation of the Caribbean, whereas our socioeconomic issues and our political issues and our climate issues are not on the agenda. And it's shocking because a lot of other countries, bigger countries, we have this sort of moral stance as Caribbean people that we take with regards to climate change, that we are the small island developing states produce the least emissions, but yet we have the worst consequences. So I think, with regards to your question, there are many, many different reasons why we don't get put on the agenda. And also because when we are on the agenda, we do get grouped with Latin America and Africa and North America. In and of itself, for us to have a voice and for us to have a strong platform is very rare. And I definitely think we need to see more of this.
Yeah, I sort of have a related point to what Aurora said as well. I think part of the challenge as well is these decisions in newsrooms of this kind of imagined audience. So let's sort of write our stories imagining what our audience wants. So how many of the people, for example, watching CNN or whatever would care about the Caribbean in a sense? So I think part of it is also this kind of imagined audience and just the reporters and sort of news managers trying to think through what do audience want rather than thinking about, for example, how can we tell broader stories about climate change, about environmental issues, using the Caribbean as a case in a sense. And so I think part of the challenge is also how those stories are framed and whether they can be framed in a way that leads to a kind of global discussion about climate change and environmental issues.
Can I say something as well? I don't know if you all know this, but there are stories such as 10 islands to visit before they disappear. Can you imagine? That's unconscionable. 10 islands to visit before they disappear. You're pushing sort of this, global north sort of narrative of go visit these islands before they disappear, really, really sort of casually. Yeah. Go on vacation before they're just gone. Those are millions of lives of people and climate refugees that will be, looking in desperate need of help. And this is something you're just casually having on, let's say, a media house is publishing this. And this is a type of problem that we face.
Thank you. And what about inside the Caribbean, how these climate stories are reported internally? Mm-hmm. Can you share some thoughts of that and in terms of, the connections between the islands and the connections between inland and the coastal regions?
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's such a question that I've been thinking about before this, because I think the gravamen of this question, I think, lies in what Aurora started when she started to talk about just how under-resourced these newsrooms are. I think in our prep last week, for example, I talked a little bit about in the Caribbean, we also don't really treat these stories, whether it's climate change, whether it's environmental issues more broadly, with any kind of depth, any kind of, I suppose, sharp critical analysis. But then I stopped myself to also think about the structural issues that cause that. So you're in a newsroom, for example, where there's a newscast at 7 p.m., as was the case when I was a reporter. The editor is looking at you and asking, what do you have for today? Yeah, I mean, you're being paid to do stories daily. So where's your story for today? So if you're stuck in a system that has a daily grind that says you must produce this story at this time, then you're obviously not going to be able to do any kind of serious thinking, any kind of deep analysis. You're not going to be going into the rural parts of any Caribbean country to dig out those kinds of stories because your editor doesn't want a story a month or two later. So you're also not getting that time to dive deep into those stories. So I think even as we critique the reporting in the Caribbean, I think we also have to look at the structure of the newsrooms and just I suppose, the economic situation that also shape these institutions as well.
Obviously to add to that, we in Trinidad and Tobago, we didn't have a journalism program until 2006. And when I did my degree, I had to leave the country in order to do my degree, my journalism degree. A lot of these journalists are trained up, from coming in, and journalists may do a degree, but not necessarily in journalism, number one. But as well, Trinidad is a major leader in the Caribbean. We are at the head of a lot of different tables. We're very well developed in the Caribbean next to Jamaica. However, like I said, there are countries with 50,000 people that have 2 people in the newsroom. And they don't even have, they've never done it, they don't have this type of resource. And constantly, to what Vashan is saying, you're saying, okay, the newscast has to happen. You have 2 people. How are you going to put together a newscast for your nation with 2 people? Yeah. And what will you focus on? If there's an accident, if there is, a murder, if there's a crime, if something happens, that's a daily news. And they must be reported on. These news values and news priorities must occur every day. So there is a lack of that expertise and critical analysis that we would need. Yeah. But that is also because of the wider structure of the level of development in a lot of these countries is, to begin with.
Yeah, and I mean, I think climate change, for example, is a serious area that requires some kind of depth and analysis. But the challenge as well is we've also done away with the beat system in, I don't know, for example, a media house that has a proper beat system, except for, I think they would have like a parliamentary reporter because they think that's serious enough to give some kind of, title to the person who does it. But I don't, for example, know somebody focusing on health, focusing on tourism, focusing on environment, focusing on climate change and so on. So I think that's also part of the problem, that in the region as well, we also don't have reporters with specialist skills in certain kinds of areas, including environment and so on and so forth as well.
You do have to wear a lot of hats. And I think also a major issue is our local journalists do want to hold our governments to account as well, because we also play a part in our own emissions that we must cover and we must hold them to account, right? We know this. However, our governments, while mostly democratic in appearance and in voting systems, I'm just going to lead with that. For example, one of the things I discovered when I was doing my PhD research, one of the editors-in-chief of one of the national newspapers told me, government ministers flood our inboxes with things that we must cover, that the government is announcing. So when we have to cover all of these things, where do we find the time to do health, to do, these other stories, again, in these under-resourced newsrooms. So there's also a type of censorship that evolves from that. And also historically, if you have governments who literally the minister will not speak to you and has banned you from the media conference or from speaking to them, and you just cannot have access, what do you do? Yeah. So there are all these other issues in newsrooms. I don't know what it's like in your newsroom in Jamaica, but I'm going to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you talked a little bit about your research as well, because I mean, I currently returned from Jamaica, where I also did field work as part of my PhD research. I interviewed close to 30 journalists. And one of the things that also came out is a kind of, let's call it ideological positioning of the newsrooms, where they are making these conscious decisions about whose voices are important, whose story is important. And on an issue like climate change and environment, what you see dominate as well are the voices of the so-called elite, whether it is the political class, whether it is business interest and so on. You could argue that broadly, that's the kind of slant that we see in the media globally. But I think that there are certain kind of nuances and peculiarity in the Caribbean. such as what Aurora mentioned as well, you also get some kind of subtle kind of calls from, the minister to say like, oh, there's this thing happening. And before you know it, it's been covered. You do an interview with a minister, you critique them, you argue, you debate the issues, and you push them to do better for their communities. But then you also have your bosses coming to you to be like, oh yeah, the minister called, and they didn't quite like how you approach this interview.
Yeah.
But yeah, I told him that, and you keep it moving. So it's not necessarily this overt way of saying, don't do that, don't do that. But it's this kind of subtle nudge that then pushed the journalists to then rethink their kind of approach to these kinds of issues.
Okay, can I come in here?
Yeah.
How do we change that? And what should we be changing it to? What are the types of stories? I mean, I know there's so many stories out there, but
yeah,
how should we change it?
Yeah.
And what to?
Yeah, I was gonna say that there are journalists I know who've had their stories completely pulled and cancelled, and this type of censorship happens. Right now, so there's an institute I work for called the Media Institute of the Caribbean, and we have 250 member journalists across the Caribbean in each country, across the Caribbean, and every year we do climate justice and climate change training, and they have access to Caribbean experts and from all across, from governmental to civil society to nonprofits, who talk about and train these journalists in what they should be covering, how to deconstruct some of the jargon, in climate finance and things like that, and then they're better able to cover the stories. Part of what happens is they do cross-border collaboration, and they strengthen each other in terms of reporting, in terms of stories that are going on, because stories, we're not, even though we are different islands, we have several of the same thematic experiences like coastal erosion, etc., happening. So journalists are becoming strengthened in their capacity to tell stories through this type of training. So that's one thing that we're currently trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, on my end, I think there's perhaps a need for more mentorship for older journalists and younger journalists. One of the central concerns throughout the interviews I did in Caribbean this summer is that a lot of the older journalists kept saying, the young journalists are the problem. I mean, they're the ones not coming with the historical context. They're the ones not understanding how, journalism works. I mean, I have my own thoughts on that, but I mean, I feel like young people get blamed for everything. Anyway. But I think as well that if they do feel like that is a central issue, then maybe there is a need, there is that space for the people with the experience, for the people who know how to build depth and so on into stories to help the younger journalists to develop these kinds of skills, which again is not separate from the point that Aurora made, because I think it's also broadly to be sort of part of that kind of training initiative, I think.
I think one of the things with, with the hurricane and awareness and education is the role journalism can play in helping to build that awareness and knowledge and, actions where people can potentially save their lives. But I just wondered how that relates to, or what your thoughts were in terms of that tension between legacy media and social media. I mean, we've heard in some of the session this morning, we were talking about the role of TikTok and when it's done well. I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that sort of tension between, if there is a tension between legacy and social media within the Caribbean.
I think there definitely is. There is a tension between verified information and unverified information, especially when you have disasters happening, you have misinformation and malinformation, making the cycle. So legacy media is important in terms of getting verified information and stories. But I think on the ground, there are multiple people filming, documenting what's happening, and they're tweeting, Instagramming, TikToking for people in the nation and abroad as well to have this information. So I do think it's happening, and it's something that is good and is good when verified. Because as well, some people are not entirely honest and will be, for some reason, creating false information, passing it around. So I do think there's a slight tension there with the lack of verification, but I think all in all, it's something that is being leaned on more and more, because we have no public media. We have state media and private media. So a lot of what happens, we're dependent on funding. And funding comes from advertisers, et cetera, et cetera. So we really need that sort of pure funding, or the person who's a citizen has no tie to the big businesses in the country, so they don't have to be careful about what they say. Whereas for journalists who work for these private media houses, they definitely do.
Yeah. I mean, I think the legacy media just needs to do better when it comes to reporting on different kinds of things, including hurricanes. So I give you an example. When Hurricane Beryl struck the other day, I mean, I spent most of my time, just watching my former employers and how they sort of treated the coverage of the hurricane and so on and so forth. And one of the things I noticed is you would get the standard newscast at, let's say, 7 o'clock with a 2-minute kind of synopsis of what took place in this particular area that was so devastated. But when you turn to social media and you see these other citizen journalists, they have a 1-hour package that details what's happening in this particular area. They're taking you into this school that was so badly damaged, and they're giving you so much depth and information that you didn't get from the legacy media. And it causes me to think that maybe part of the strategy that the legacy media can also use is to also rethink how stories are told, especially at a time of disaster, so that you also give viewers more. People also want to know what's really happening. And I think maybe you can't do that in a 2-minute story. Maybe you perhaps need 30 minutes to do it. Maybe you need a full-length interview to do it. It's also about thinking about different forms and style that the journalism can take, especially at a time of disaster. So I think that, that I think reveals the tension in some ways. But I have to also give credit where it's due, in the sense that a lot of traditional or legacy media sort of organizations, they're also trying to set up social media departments. They're also trying to put some of their posts on TikTok, on Instagram. So there is also that kind of synergy happening. Whether I think that's happening too slow, yes, I do think so.
Just to also give some context and qualify as to why these things happen so slowly, with Caribbean islands, progress in, especially in government or in these sectors, tends to be very slow. So for legacy media, the media economy and how it's set up cannot at the moment accommodate this type of social media surge. For example, their advertisers tend to be very traditional, and at the moment still advertise in newspapers. People still buy broadsheets in our countries, and also on the 7 o'clock news, the airtime. So to transition from, into this new advertising space and new revenue generating space is very difficult. This is another reason why it's sort of a challenge for us to move into the more to the social media space as well.
So I just want to touch on a really important question, because I think we've probably not talked about it enough today, is the risks faced by journalists who are reporting on climates and hurricanes and all of these things. What are some of your thoughts on the risks that they face and how we can try to mitigate some of those risks? Because I think it's really important that that's central to our conversation. We're expecting these journalists to deliver these stories, and we're pushing them to deliver better stories. So we must think about their safety and the consequences on them.
Yeah. I think personal safety is very important. I was doing one of the things one of my interviews said to me the other day. Hurricane Ivan, I think, struck Jamaica in 2004, thereabout. And she tells me that even to this day, she cannot go to the beach, because those images of the sea level rising, the communities being affected, houses being washed away, is just really still in her mind. And she didn't know that it could affect her to this very day. And so the mental health costs, I think, is very, very high. I think one of the things that they train a lot of journalists to do is to divorce yourself from the story, to ignore the fact that you're embedded in these communities, which, I mean, I obviously disagree with, because I think it affects you. And I think understanding that there are mental costs to covering these stories, these are people that you know, these are communities that you're connected to, these are areas that you've traversed, I think is also going to be very important, because there are significant mental health costs.
I believe it was a journalist in Grenada who they were reporting on Beryl, and literally the studio they're reporting from was torn apart, and they had to run out before it was torn apart. And this is, the risks are life and death. I'll say that again, the risks are life and death. And also because, as we'd spoken about before, about the recourse and the shelters and places to go might not be accessible. And also the PTSD is something that is also life and death. And there's no, at least in the newsrooms that I've covered, I've worked in, and that I've studied in, there is very little mental health development and recourse to sort of say, I have these issues, can you help me? And as well, the Caribbean being a largely patriarchal system operating in a lot of the Caribbean islands, mental health is not something that's ever even really spoken about to a large extent. So that is something that is a massive challenge for us as well. So there are multiple challenges on many different levels. After Soufriere a few years ago, there was massive water shortages, food shortages, and Caribbean islands mobilized and Caribbean journalists mobilized to help each other in between islands as well. So that cross-border collaboration and help is present, but it's nowhere near the scale that we need it to be at.
Okay, this is my last question. I think we've got time, but it's an important one because I don't want to finish the conversation on, there's a problem, there's another problem. Yeah. So I think if we had access to that, what was it, $1 billion tax from the billionaire from the previous panel, how would you spend it to address some of the problems that you've kind of highlighted?
Yeah, I think my first point is always going to be building the capacity of journalists. And I think a big part of that is really first understanding specifically what the challenges are. I think the work that Aurora and I have been doing in the Caribbean in terms of research, that is, I think, a major stepping stone. But I think there needs to be more research and understanding of the peculiarity of journalism in the Caribbean, how it works, because I think the Western frameworks that we have and the understanding of journalism that we have, a lot of the scholarship comes from the US, the UK. I think, first of all, we need to invest some of that in perhaps setting up some kind of research think tank that helps us to understand specifically what the journalism needs are, the impact on journalists, and so on and so forth.
We are really good at covering climactic episodes, and then COP comes around and it's sort of this thing that we can cover. But the in-between is where we really need to build the work. So the same way in increasing education, building capacity of journalists, increasing access to experts as well. We have a lot of brilliant scientists in the Caribbean and a lot of people in civil society and non-government organizations who can speak to these issues. However, in terms of accessing them, that seems to be a challenge. And I believe that covering the climate, covering the environment definitely starts from primary school and into secondary school, into etc. And we need to get younger people involved in research. We need to get younger people involved in solutions. I used to work on a show Caribbean-wide where we would feature conservation efforts by people in various Caribbean countries. And there were massive conservation efforts going on, but you either didn't know about them because they were happening maybe in the coastal area, or you didn't know about them from island to island. So definitely more inter-island communication and features on things like that can build capacity on multiple levels, not just journalism, but multiple levels to face the climate crisis.
Thank you. Let's see if we have any questions within the audience. Any questions for our panelists? Oh, so yeah, just over here. If you can just give us your name and what organisation, if you represent an organisation, please.
Hi, thanks. Oh, that's loud. Thanks very much. Bharti Patel. I'm currently chair of Global Girls Media, which is basically training young women from diverse backgrounds on precisely what you've just said, how to communicate, how to write stories around these issues, and then making sure that these are reported to the right audiences. But my question's really very much on what Vashan said, which is that, the turnaround of journalists having to write the stories is such a short period, and you've only got 400 words to write. One thing that I feel is missing when I'm reading stories in whatever broadsheets or even local stories, I think the voice of the people that are working on the ground actually trying to mitigate the impact of climate change on, sort of farming, watershed management, that voice is missing. And one of the things that I would like to see journalists do is actually invest some of your time to build that relationship. So when you are writing the story, you don't need to be on the ground, but you've got people on the ground that have got the expertise, bringing that voice in. Now, yes, I agree there are risks, particularly in countries where governments are not keen on raising this issue. But again, something that needs to be looked at. So building the capacity of local activists, not journalists, who then can communicate to journalists. I think that's a big miss right now. I feel that voice is missing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I can address part of what you read. I mean, I don't disagree at all. What I would also say is that I think that's also part of the situation facing newsrooms and the kind of easy way you want to meet the deadline, right? So if, for example, you can call just one person to get your story in for the day, then you might do that instead of having to stress to find activists, to find people on the ground who are really affected. If the minister says, we're going to be doing this for the community and we're going to do that, you perhaps don't properly interrogate it. You just parrot what the minister says, again, because of the kind of structure of these organizations. So I think the point you raise is obviously not divorced from the overall political economic context within these institutions, within which these institutions operate, I think. I think journalists absolutely need to do better. I think we absolutely need more voices in stories. One of the things that we talk a lot about is that diversity of viewpoint is important for democracy. It's important, but we also rarely ever see that kind of diversity of viewpoint. But again, I think there are, structural issues that cause that as well.
Thanks. So I'm Rob from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Are you sort of saying, I mean, I'm curious to know what your views are on whether there's an appetite or a need for investigative journalism on climate in the Caribbean? And if so, what are the kind of topics or what stories might sort of shift the dial in the way that the media covers climate change?
The Media Institute of the Caribbean, we have an arm called the Caribbean Investigative Journalism Network, and there are investigative stories on the Caribbean, particularly financing and the way the financing goes. As well, we're exploring how to involve Indigenous communities more as well in a lot of the decision-making of vulnerable groups and how to bring them in, and how to keep our governments accountable also in terms of investigating part of how the money is spent in our own countries.
I mean, I think yes is the easy answer. I think we need investigative journalism on all sorts of different things. I'm always amazed at the reception that I get whenever I do a documentary in Jamaica. People are like, yes, because it also shows that there's a need for that kind of work. Quite recently, one of my former colleagues, she did a documentary on Too Hot to Handle, which is really trying to help Jamaicans understand the fact that the place is getting hotter and hotter. It's not just because the sun is getting bigger or something, but it also has to be put in a broader discourse about climate and so on. So I think there is a need for that kind of investigation. How are we going to get there? I think it probably would have to be what I was doing over the years. I tried to meet my deadlines while at the same time doing my documentary as a kind of side project. Like, this is not really my real work. But it ought to be, right? It's that kind of investigative thing is really important to journalism. And when you do that kind of thing, you win all sorts of awards because then it's recognized as something that's just so rare, which is not supposed to be, I think.
And a lot of these organizations and these documentaries are based on funding. And a lot of times we are competing with Latin America for funding or North America or certain countries in Africa. And again, our little Caribbean corner of the world, our archipelago, does not get the funding most times.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's also the other journalists around as well, right? I mean, you enter a newsroom, your colleagues are asking you, so what have you done this week? Oh, you haven't done any stories. Oh, you're still working on that documentary? Oh my God. I worked on a documentary for 6 months and I felt so bad. I had to be doing other stories in between just to make it appear as if, yes, I'm actually not here wasting time. I'm actually doing real work. It's just so crazy how this kind of discourse between what is real work and what is not. But then at the end of the day, when you produce the documentary, it comes on air, it's celebrated, everybody loves it, the newsroom wins an award, and they're like, yes, this is the kind of work we need more of. And you're like, yeah, you think?
Another question over there.
Hi, I'm a journalism student, and I was just curious. You mentioned that In the Caribbean, a lot of people still rely on traditional forms of media to get their news. And when that comes to the mobilization of youth and younger people, do they tend to get their news in a similar way, or are there other channels in which they're able to mobilize and discuss these topics?
So the legacy media is currently in a panic because of this, because they're obviously young people are now getting their news via social media, which has its own challenges with verification, etc. But they are losing readers and audience really fast, and they are suffering. And advertisers are now sort of migrating, moving over to using influencers, etc. And it's a massive hole in the financing and in the media economy. And it's really interesting because traditional journalists might not, newsrooms in the last couple of years have cut well, I can say only scores because we're a tiny island. So, but scores across, across the industry, and people have just lost their jobs because they cannot, because we rely on legacy advertising for these media houses, and the advertisers are now going to social media, regular journalists are just losing their jobs. So there's now the people who've been trained and put on the job to verify and produce proper information are now are losing their jobs. And the people who are doing citizen journalism, which whilst great, however, the challenges of misinformation and a lack of verification are the ones now taking up the spotlight. So it's also another societal challenge that we have.
Thank you. I think is it a really quick question? Because we go on. We need the mic.
I just wanted to ask about something you mentioned just now and also during the discussion, the specific problem of misinformation, disinformation. You see this as something that is, I just wanted to know a bit more about your experiences specifically in the Caribbean and around hurricanes.
Okay, around hurricanes. Okay, well, I'll give you an example. Because of the sort of communication systems we have, and the tight turnaround and the lack of people to verify things, there are stories where you may be waiting for the newscast or to go to print, because obviously you have to print before the next day, and you might not have verification. You might not have actual. Let's say someone has died, and maybe it's a particularly curious circumstances, or maybe a government minister is involved. There have been cases where people have actually gone to publish even though they didn't have verification. These are legacy media news outlets, and they're completely wrong. And the public, massive loss of trust in these legacy media houses. Whereas, with something like social media, and with the need for verification in social media, for example, the amount of people that may have been killed, or areas to avoid if there's flooding in a certain area. And let's say there's flooding there's a storm surge or flooding in a certain area at 10 o'clock in the morning, but the message is making the rounds at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and there's no more flooding in that area, and it is possible for traffic or footfall through that path, but you're reporting it as if it was the same as 10 a.m. then that's not really effective communication or information people to make decisions, life or death decisions sometimes. So that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the way it also plays out is a sort of inter-Caribbean sort of coverage of disasters. I remember when they had Hurricane Maria and Irma some years ago that devastated Barbuda, for example, and parts of the Eastern Caribbean. And some of the images that were being reported in different countries, those weren't the real images, but people also didn't know how to get images. So they go on Twitter and they see this airport that's completely covered with water, and they somehow end up putting that on traditional media. And then later on you hear, sorry, that wasn't that country. And so I think that also helps to erode the kind of trust as well. And I suppose it also speaks to the kind of inter-Caribbean coverage of these kinds of things and how it can also be complex.
I think we had time. Do we have time for one more quick question? Thank you.
There's a hand over there.
No, there was one.
Hi, thank you. It was super informative. I was wondering if part of the issue with some of the Western media and the treatment of hurricanes specifically was the way that it was just focusing on visual imagery of like devastated airports and roads, and whether that would be inadapted whether people that were experiencing the hurricanes thought it was inadapted because maybe like re-traumatizing in some ways. So instead of like looking at images or journalism about some of the consequences of hurricanes, just like bombardment of spectacular images, whether you thought that was an issue, or maybe it's just like you still need those images and you can work around them.
It is disaster porn, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, people sort of, there's this, you know, psychological connection to that as well, and seeing these types of images. And a lot of times, because of the lack of imagery that international people are receiving, they constantly use these photos over and over. And it is devastating. It is to see that every day. I mean, while there are pros and cons to it, in that you can see what's going on in parts of the country, etc., to keep having that image every day is something that is not easy to see.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to interject. We do have to get out the room. I'm really sorry. It feels as if we've just scratched the surface, but I think the whole purpose of these events is that we make the connections, we start the conversations, but we take them outside of this room and we carry on and we build these networks that we need to be able to make change happen, to be able to improve the journalism that we deliver. Thank you so much for attending. I just want to say a particular thank you to Channel 4 for hosting, amazing building and premises, and also the tech team, fab. And also thank you to our partners, specifically Mercy Corps. I don't know if anyone is still here from Mercy Corps. Yay! So thank you. If you don't know about One World Media and you want to know more about what we do and how we work with some of these regions, please check our website or just ask us during the drinks reception, me or one of the team. So it's been great, really interesting conversations. Thank you.